Hello and welcome to the Center for Bible Study and to our study called Conversations in First Peter. These are a series of monthly conversations about the first letter of Peter. And I will be joined by a number of different pastors and scholars and people who will be engaging with me about the letter over the next 10 months or so. And I'm joined today by the Reverend Annie Giannotto, who is the rector of St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Rockland, California, in the Diocese of Northern California. I myself am the rector of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, again in the Diocese of Northern California, in Antelope in Northern California. And we'll discuss a little about the background of the letter today. And I'm very glad to have Annie joining me for this conversation. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you, Peter. I'm grateful that you invited me to join you on this conversation. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about this. I know this has been a point of study for you for many years, so this will be fascinating. Personally, so I'm a biblical scholar, as most priests are, and just a theologian, and so in general, I've studied all of the scripture, and First Peter has always been fascinating. You know, Peter, of course, it's attributed to Peter, so he is one of the pillars of the church. So I can't wait to hear more about what you have to say about this book. I must admit that I don't have a lot of study in this particular text. And so I can't wait to see what you have to say about it.
Well, I look forward to this conversation and the others in this series, because we all can learn together. The Center for Bible Study, as you know, is primarily aimed at helping lay people become more competent in their ministry, especially those who read the scripture, preach or lead in services or lead Bible studies or teach Sunday school. And these are particularly designed to help them understand the first letter of Peter.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I have a couple of questions for you that I think would take us into some deeper study of this book. So are you up for some questions?
I certainly am. These usually last about a half an hour, and you get into deeper study. You know, it could take a while longer, but there'll be many more conversations, and there'll be some threads we pick up in other conversations. So go ahead. What's your first question?
Great. Yeah. Well, I wanted you to start with some of the basics, like why should we study this first letter of Peter? And, you know, especially why today? Is there some kind of significance that this book of scripture has for us, for people today at this time?
Yes, thank you for that. It's a very good question. And first of all, we want to study the first letter of Peter because it is one of the gems of the New Testament, of the Christian revelation. And Martin Luther, in fact, the great theologian and leader of the Reformation, classed it with John and Romans as among the gems of the New Testament and deeply to be studied. Well, and why study it today? Well, it's about, it's addressed to Christians who are under trial and persecution, especially for their faith. And today, especially, increasing numbers of people in the world are under pressure because of their Christian faith. But there's another special reason why we need to study First Peter, and that has to do with what is going on in our church. This is particularly the Episcopal or Anglican Church, which we are a member of, the Worldwide Anglican Communion. And that is that the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Most Reverend Justin Welby, has chosen First Peter as the text for special study for the bishops who will meet next summer all together in Canterbury. And this is the scripture text around which they want to shape their conversations. And the church has been invited to study along with them. each of us getting to know this letter better. In fact, a book has been published, which Jennifer Strawbridge of Oxford has edited, called 1 Peter, a Global Commentary, and I highly recommend it. And that will help us to think along with our bishops, our Bishop Megan Traquair and the other bishops who are meeting there next summer. So we, especially in the Anglican Church, have a special reason right now to study this letter. But of course, it could be studied anytime by anyone to great profit.
Well, that's excellent. So yeah, this does seem very timely,
Yeah.
especially for people in our community. That's wonderful. And I alluded to Peter, the wonderful apostle, and the letter begins with Peter, apostle of Jesus Christ. And for the longest time, the letter has been accepted as a letter of St. Peter to Christians in Asia Minor. But I understand that in some of the modern era, Peter's authorship has been questioned, and a variety of different dates have been proposed for this letter. What do you make of this, and where do you stand on these questions?
Well, yes. Anyone who studies scripture deeply, and this particular piece of scripture has at some point to encounter that question. There is spiritual value to be derived from the letter, no matter where you come out on this particular point. But I think it's a very important question, and I've wrestled with it a good deal. There are basically, I mean, there are some scholars who today think that the letter probably was not written by Peter. Many scholars in the Scholarly Guild think that probably a date later in the 1st century is the right place at the 2nd generation and so forth, maybe a follower of Peter, an admirer of Peter. You ask where I stand. I came out, I published, edited a commentary some years ago with some of my students from Fuller Theological Seminary. And the position I took there, which is a position still being taken by some distinguished scholars, is that Peter was the author of the letter. The letter was written sometime in the middle of the 60s, obviously before 64, when there was the persecution in Rome under Nero, a persecution which was occasioned because there was a fire in Rome and the blame was fixed on the Christians. And Peter and Paul both ended their lives in that persecution. So the letter, if it was written by Peter, it would obviously have to have been written before the summer of 64. I think that actually the summer was, I'll tell you what, the brief picture of what I think has happened is that Peter and those who were with him heard about some trouble, some persecution perhaps happening in Asia Minor, feeling also the pressure in the early summer of 64 AD. And they began to write a letter saying you may have to suffer various trials and so forth. And then there comes the fire, the blame of the Christians being put to death. And Peter realizes that they're really under pressure, and not only to finish the letter, but perhaps they're under pressure for their lives, as indeed they were. And the tone of the letter does change to a much more immediate persecution situation, as a number of scholars have noticed after 4 verse 12. And the fiery trials that come upon you. And then the letter goes on in that particular way right through the end of chapter 4. So, and I believe that therefore the summer, July of 64 is the likely date when Peter wrote the letter. But to say that Peter wrote the letter is rather to miss the richness of what is in this letter and how Peter brought it together. One of the main reasons that scholars give that Peter could not have written this letter is that the Greek is so good that a Galilean fisherman could not have pulled together such a letter with this kind of style. And those who still defend the Petrine authorship, as I do, turn to 5 verse 12, where Peter says, through Silvanus, dia Silvanu, through Silvanus, I have written to you briefly, and then this the true grace of God. And then and so it's reasonable to suggest that Silvanus, who is almost certainly the Silas of Acts, helped Peter in a letter that he could not have written at this level of Greek. Having said that, Karen Jobs, whose commentary I highly recommend, is I think the best in the field, in the Baker exegetical series, all the Greeks in parenthesis, you can read the commentary without knowing Greek. And she has done a special study at the end of that commentary, showing that the Greek of First Peter is not quite so good as scholars sometimes make it out to be. That it's a Hellenistic Greek, which is a sort of koine with a little extra, rather like Polybius or some parts of the Greek Old Testament. And so this is perhaps overblown. But just simply to see that Peter wrote the letter with the help of Silvanus, I think misses, as I say, the richness of what we have in the letter itself. Because Peter goes on to talk about that he greets the people in Asia Minor to whom he's writing, and he says that the Mark is greeting you, and also the elect lady of Babylon. Now in the NRSV it says the church, the elect church in Babylon, the chosen church, and that's there's nothing about the church, of course, in the text. And I believe, following Judith Applegate, who did a very creative article around 1990, that the elect lady was in fact a lady, that she was as a woman, a person. So you have these three people together with Peter as a kind of collaborative team putting together this letter, engaging with the themes of the letter that engages then with the apostolic gospel that Peter and Paul and James and the others were preaching, and John, and so this letter is, if you like, a collaborative effort between all of them. And I think that that alone answers to the richness of what you find in this letter. We have other questions, so I don't want to labor that. You can find my full argument for this in the commentary called 1 Peter, a collaborative commentary, the introduction, published by Withen Stock in 2017. One more thing about the elect lady. Many people say, well, it was a church, but one of the reasons that Peter may not have mentioned her by name was precisely because as a woman, perhaps in a household where her husband was not a believer, either a non-Christian Jewish person or a non-Christian pagan person, I think more likely a Jewish one, and that'll come on in another one of these podcasts, that Peter did not mention her name because he did not want to put her in any greater danger. And so the circumlocution about the elect lady. Anyway, enough of that. So that's my view on the authorship. There are other arguments used against the Petrine authorship. And Andrew Walls, the late great Andrew Walls, the great mission scholar, who was a biblical scholar before he became a mission scholar, did an introduction in the Tyndale series in the early 1960s. And he really answered all the objections in a way that I think is well worth reading.
That's fascinating. And I mean, writing as a community was very common in that time. So that makes a lot of sense. I like your arguments there. I hope you go into more depth in that in some of your later versions of this podcast, because that's fascinating. But you mentioned some of the people in this community. Who do you think that Peter wrote this letter to, or who is this text written to? Were they mainly Jewish or were they Gentile Christians?
Well, the letter says that they're the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, 5 provinces that you can look at clockwise. If you go around, you look at them clockwise. That's the way they're named in Asia Minor, what is today modern Turkey. And most of the earliest Christian writers who cite 1 Peter and talk about it think that the recipients, those who received the letter, were Jews. The modern situation, that's all except to 2 very distinguished outliers, and that is Jerome and Augustine. Their names to conjure with, so be careful. But they thought that it was written to Gentiles. But almost all modern commentators say that it was written rather to Gentiles in Asia Minor. Recently, there's been a bit of a revolt to that consensus. Again, Karen Jobs in her commentary on First Peter points out, that the little Jewish communities in Asia Minor had people added to their numbers in the late 40s of the Christian era. 40 in the year 49, the Emperor Claudius threw the Jews out of Rome, expelled them from Rome, as Suetonius, a historian, says, because of disputes over a certain Crestus. And some people, myself included, take this to mean, of course, Jewish communities where whether Jesus was the Messiah was very much a dispute. Claudius got sick of it and he expelled them. And Karen Jobs points out that when they were expelled, many of them settled in the provinces around the empire. And those who had to leave Rome, there were settlements of these people in all 5 provinces mentioned in the first letter of Peter. And so they added to the Jewish community. Now there were perhaps some other Gentiles, as Gentiles were, of course, added in the Pauline communities and so forth. But I believe that the people to whom the letter was written were largely Jewish, with some Gentiles sprinkled in. And one of the reasons for that is the use of the Old Testament. Just so, I mean, there's no document of the New Testament that quotes the Old Testament more extensively, verse for verse, than does the first letter of Peter. The only thing comes close to it is Romans 9 through 11, and that part of the letter of the Romans. And of course, Revelation alludes right the way through to the Old Testament, but not many quotations. But First Peter is just packed full of quotations, allusions, and echoes of the Old Testament. Those references which a largely Gentile group would not be able to understand or access in quite the same way if they recently been converted from a Gentile or paganism to the Christian faith. Even J.H. Eliot, whose marvelous commentary with wonderful lexical aids, huge commentary in the Anchor Bible, although he thinks that the recipients were largely Gentiles, he has to admit there must be some Jews in the company in order that because they would not otherwise understand the extensive use of the Old Testament. So, bit of a rebel, Karen Jobs, Ben Witherington, wonderful commentary, and Joel Green, and I believe also Craig Keener, that's in his background commentary. I have not had a chance yet to see his new commentary on First Peter, but they're rebels to the modern consensus, and myself.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And I mean, I think that would, go in line with some of the fight between Paul and Peter. It did seem like Peter was much more aligned with Jews than with the Gentile Christians. And so that's fascinating that you think that. That's great.
So in Galatians, you can read, if you read along, and that Paul was to go to the Gentiles and Peter was to be administering among the Jews. Yes, you do see that. But it's a lively question. And of course, behind it is the great question of what they call the parting of the ways. That is to say, at what point did the church become a truly Gentile phenomenon? And since the time is running on, I'll just give my view, and people can argue with me if they like. That is that I believe that the church remained far more Jewish, far longer in many places, particularly I suspect in Egypt and in Asia Minor, than in other places. Rome was an exception because when the Jews were thrown out, the church was all Gentile, and then remained so, I think, to a larger degree. But in many places in the empire, the church remained very Jewish right into the 2nd century, into the end of it. But I could talk about that for an hour, so that's another matter. Yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting matter. So I appreciate that thought. Really, really interesting work there. So, those were some of the questions I had prepared for our time together today. many things came up. But I'm wondering, is there anything else from my questions here that kind of have bubbled up for you that you feel like is really important to say before we wrap up?
Well, these are ongoing conversations, so I'll probably say a lot in the course of my time and discussing with different people. But yeah, I do want to say that it's vitally important in studying this letter to remember to read it. And I read, I mean, I had an Old Testament professor. He was one of the translators, actually, of the NRSV. His name was Bob Denton. He was a very great man. He used to say to us in the Old Testament class, I read the Bible. It sheds amazing light on the commentaries. And it's short enough. You can read it in one sitting. And there's a great value to reading it in one sitting, to hear it as a whole missive, a whole letter, a whole tractate written to these scattered groups. And the other thing is to realize that, as has been emphasized in the global commentary, that it is for all peoples in different sorts of circumstances. And the way in which it encourages us to realize, and this comes out certainly in the first two chapters, and that tone is sustained right the way through, that this gospel is for you. For you can almost be underlined as key words in the you are a royal priest, a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, that you may declare the wonderful deeds of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were no people, now you were God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So that's the way in which the gospel comes through to you, that the prophets who prophesied long ago, this was written for your sake and what come to you, not just first century Christians in Asia Minor, but down through the ages, to you and to me. These are matters into which angels long to peek.
That's amazing. So that brings me to the question of what started your passion for this particular book of scripture?
Reading it, I think, first of all, and secondly, because it was
your own advice.
because it was neglected when I went to go do my research in Oxford. I said to myself, well, what shall I study? I mean, I didn't put it quite that way, but it seemed to me that the Gospels and Paul had so much written about them that while I was doing my study, I'd spend most of the time reading the secondary literature rather than the letter itself or the tractate itself, and some of the background Old Testament and intertestamental literature that went into the making of the letter, that I was spending so much time on what the scholars said that I never hear what the letter said. And I thought that was fascinating. This letter needed to be front and center, as it is a wonderful compendium of Christian faith and life. And so, I mean, I suppose that's what impelled me. I have to think back almost 50 years ago to let you know what I really felt when I was getting into it. But it just kind of gripped me. And because there were, the other thing, when I did my work, I did it primarily on the use of the Old Testament in First Peter. And there was a very exciting movement going on at that time of which I wanted to be a part. And that is the rediscovery of not only the Jewishness of the New Testament, but the thorough pattern of Old Testament use in throughout the scripture. And Christopher Stendahl had done a first-rate piece on the Gospel of Matthew called The School of Matthew, his use of the Old Testament. You asked earlier about the whole matter of a group of people studying the scripture. His whole idea of a school patterned after rabbinic schools. I think he's onto something. And I thought it was fascinating, okay? And then,
since we mentioned that, can we do a throw out to your own book that you wrote about that subject?
Exploring the Old Testament and the New. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that again, Whiff & Stock published that in 2012, and in which I looked at various different aspects of how ways in which lenses into which one can penetrate the varied and fascinating use of the Old Testament in the New, form, introduction, selection, and combination, and so forth. History of how the text was used elsewhere and so forth. So yeah, that was a fun book to write, and some people have found that quite helpful.
Yes. I know quite a few of them that have found it very transformational.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I have done some Center for Bible Study courses on that book. I used it as the course book, and I hope to do that again in the next year or two as the Center for Bible Study has even a more robust presence than it's had so far.
Excellent.
It is one of the treasures of having to go online that we find that the Center for Bible Study has taken a greater reach. And so I hope that these conversations on First Peter will have the reach of helping people to numbers of people who wouldn't be able to come to an in-person course because of the distance, to help them to access this letter and to come to know this letter and to love it and to cherish it and memorize it, you know.
Memory.
Yeah,
Okay,
well,
that's a higher standard that I'm going to take.
I think in English would be fine. Before I went to do my degree at Oxford, for 6 months, all I had was a cassette tape in those days. But for 6 months before I went, when I did all my rounds, went round to the hospital to visit parishioners or ran errands, I always had the tape running in the car with First Peter in Greek on it. I got a scholar to read it off, and he was a fairly good reader. So you know, there you are. That's why I could have said, rather, you're a chosen race. I could have said, Genos eklekton basilian heratum ethnos hagion, and so forth, because it became, it got into my bloodstream. It was, to quote the words I loved from the My Fair Lady, became second nature to me now, like breathing out and breathing in. And this is when you want to get to know the scriptures, okay? I'm not saying.
I've got to say, friends who are watching this, you do not have to memorize it in Greek in order to.
I mean, it's absolutely right. So you may want to pick up a word or two, like charis, grace, okay? Or, you know, some of the big Christian words, agape, love, which you already know anyway. But what does it mean to talk about a non-hypocritical love, as Peter speaks about it toward the end of the first chapter? What does that mean? So it's not only a letter that will force us to think deeply, theologically, and think about the scriptures and engage with how Peter engages the Old Testament scriptures and what that means for us. It's also a supremely practical letter. I could talk more about that if there was more time, but I've sort of determined that these should be half-hour podcasts, and so we've come just about to the end of the hour. Well, let me say one thing more before I quit, okay? Because I think it's very, very important for understanding the letter that Peter, in this letter, together with his collaborators, and Paul and James all participate in the same kind of teaching in theology, but especially in a way of life, a catechetical pattern, a way of behavior. What Peter uses the word anastrophe, really, behavior, or how you conduct yourself, to talk about this. And this is an interesting pattern, which was discovered really in the modern period by Archbishop Philip Carrington, who was the Archbishop of Quebec and the Metropolitan of all Canada in the 50s and 60s. And he wrote a book called Earliest Christian Catechism. Gordon Selwyn, in his classic commentary on First Peter, wrote an essay at the end of that commentary, which is big enough to be a book on its own, all about how that pattern can be teased out from the New Testament and displayed. And the pattern is basically a fivefold pattern: put off the old person, put on the new, submit, watch and pray, stand and resist the devil. Now, already I can hear some people saying, submit, what's that all about? I think we'll save that for the next conversation, where I know it's going to come up. Because Brian Lucas, who is my next conversation partner, he and I have had some very, I've learned a lot from him in understanding where all that goes. So in any case, this particular pattern, and you know, I had to discover this pattern because when I was at Oxford, I bought the whole library of the Archbishop Carrington, who had deceased recently, before that, and I bought the whole library, and there it was sitting in front of me. And so I really got to know it. And of course, I was studying Selwyn because his commentary was the go-to commentary in those days. Now I think I'm bumped by Karen Jobs, but yeah, we could say more. I mean, I could tell you if you want a short commentary that's brilliant, Howard Marshall in the InterVarsity Press series, I think it's wonderful. Scott McKnight does the IVP application Bible, which is a wonderful commentary. These are the ones just off the top of my head that I would recommend. They'd be really helpful for especially like a layperson or a lay preacher. I know there are a number of, in this diocese, a number throughout the church who preach on Sunday and prepare to preach or to read lessons or to teach Sunday school. And
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
conversations, these are the people primarily, the conversations are meant to encourage and help. Clergy can look in if they want to. Well, thank you, Annie, for taking the time with me. And I really
It has been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right. Well, God bless you, and God bless all who happen to listen to this podcast. It will be posted soon on the Center for Bible Study website. So take care, and we'll see all of you in about a month's time.